Welcome back to the Daily Brain. I'm so glad you're with us again. Our mission here is to help you feel confident in any conversation.
Absolutely.
And you're making that happen, investing in your communication skills.
That's right.
So let's jump right into today's word. It's
This is a good one.
ubiquitous. It's a word that sounds really complex.
Yeah, it does.
But once you kind of unpack it a little bit,
Yeah.
you realize it's everywhere.
Literally, ubiquitous basically means something is found just everywhere.
Right.
And, that idea of being everywhere can really have a big impact on how things work.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, think about technology
Yeah.
or business trends
Yeah, for sure.
or even just how we experience the world around us.
So let's get specific. Merriam-Webster defines ubiquitous as present, appearing, or found everywhere.
It's pretty straightforward, actually.
It is. And they give this great example. The company's advertisements are ubiquitous.
Oh, I bet you can think of a few companies like that.
Yep.
Those ads you just can't escape.
The ones you see everywhere you go.
Exactly. And you know what else is a perfect example? Smartphones.
Oh, yeah?
Like in that YouTube video we have, smartphones have become so ubiquitous.
It's true.
We use them for everything.
It really is hard to imagine life without one now, isn't it?
Totally.
But it's interesting. Thinking about Dr. L's article on college learning,
Oh, yeah. What about it?
it made me think about how sometimes resisting these ubiquitous things can actually make things harder. Like online learning platforms, for example.
Interesting point.
Sometimes going with the flow of what's common can actually help you succeed.
It's funny because Dr. L was really focused on resisting change, especially in academics. Like, think about students who are used to writing a certain way in high school.
Right.
They get to college, and suddenly those old habits just don't work anymore.
I see what you mean.
And if they cling to them, they might really struggle. Dr. L argues that being open to adapting is super important for growth.
It's that fear of failure, isn't it? Like being afraid to do something differently and messing up.
I think so. It holds so many people back.
It can be paralyzing.
Yeah.
But sometimes you have to try new things, even if it feels uncomfortable.
Absolutely. It's funny, the Business Day article talked about how businesses actually aim to be ubiquitous.
Really?
They want to be everywhere all the time.
So they want to be that company with the inescapable ads.
Exactly. Like on social media, companies use scheduling tools to ensure a constant presence, even when they're not actively posting.
It's true. They are always there.
Yeah.
Like top of mind all the time. I loved that story in the Business Day article about the person who felt ubiquitous just because people were talking about them.
Oh, yeah, that was a good one.
It just goes to show that ubiquity isn't just about physical presence.
Right.
It can be about reputation and influence, too.
That's a really good point. And I think that ties into what the Professional Leadership Institute was saying.
Oh, how so?
They were arguing that just being everywhere isn't enough to be successful.
Interesting.
In fact, they said that ubiquity itself isn't a competitive advantage. If everyone's doing it, it's no longer special,
Makes sense. So what does this all mean for you, our listener? Think about your field, your industry, your daily life.
Yeah.
What are those things that are so ubiquitous, so common, that everyone just accepts them as the norm?
Great question.
Are they actually the best way to do things, or could there be a better approach?
Your dictionary gives some interesting examples that go beyond just technology.
Oh, like what?
Like fashion trends that become ubiquitous.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. Like, remember when everyone was wearing bell-bottoms?
Exactly. And then they talked about feelings, things like love, fear, and joy.
Wow, that's getting deep.
Right. Those feelings are ubiquitous because they are pretty much universally experienced.
So ubiquity really touches so many parts of our lives.
Yeah.
Recognizing those ubiquitous elements,
Right.
the things that are everywhere, can really help us analyze trends, become better communicators, and even spot opportunities where we can make things better.
Absolutely. It's amazing how this idea of ubiquity connects back to what Dr. L is saying about resisting change.
Oh, it really does, yeah.
Yeah.
It's almost like there's this kind of push and pull
Uh-huh.
between wanting the comfort of familiar things and then also knowing that sometimes we really need to embrace new ways of doing things.
Right. And finding that balance.
Yeah.
It's really what Dr. L emphasizes, especially when it comes to learning. It's not about just rejecting everything new, right?
Right.
But it's also not about blindly accepting everything that comes your way.
It's about being discerning,
Yeah.
choosing what works best for you, and just being open to adjusting as you go.
Absolutely. And I think a big part of that is overcoming that fear of failure that Dr. L talks about so much.
Yeah.
It really does hold a lot of people back.
It can be paralyzing. Yeah, for sure. So how can we break free from that, especially when it comes to, trying new things?
That's the question.
Stepping outside our comfort zones.
Well, Dr. L actually suggests shifting our perspective on failure a little bit. So instead of seeing it as, a setback,
Yeah.
what if we saw it as valuable feedback?
Oh, okay.
Like, okay, well, that didn't work quite as planned, but what can I learn from it?
Yeah.
How can I adjust my approach?
So it's more about embracing the process and just being open to those kind of course corrections along the way.
Precisely. And, that ties back to ubiquity in an interesting way.
Oh, how so?
Well, when something becomes ubiquitous, it can often lead to standardization, which can actually stifle innovation. So Dr. L's advice, I think, really encourages us to challenge those norms, to resist that pressure to conform,
Right.
to constantly be seeking ways to evolve our thinking.
It's like we need to cultivate this kind of mindset of constructive disruption, I guess.
Yes.
Always questioning those things that, everyone takes for granted and just looking for ways to improve them.
Exactly. And that's where creativity comes in. Remember how your dictionary talked about those fashion trends that became ubiquitous?
Yeah.
Well, someone had to break the mold, right?
Right.
Someone had to come up with those new styles in the first place.
It's true. It's like those fashion innovators, they tapped into a collective desire for something different, I guess.
Yeah.
Something that wasn't already everywhere.
Exactly.
They saw a gap and they filled it.
That's it. And I think that applies to any field, whether it's technology or business or personal growth. It's that ability to recognize the limitations of what's ubiquitous
Right.
and to imagine something new. That's really what drives progress.
So let's make this practical for our listeners. If someone's trying to, overcome that fear of failure,
Yeah.
be more open to change, and be more innovative, what are some concrete steps they can take?
Well, first, I think it's really important to identify your own resistance points.
Yeah.
What are those ubiquitous things in your life that you've always accepted without question?
Right.
And once you've kind of pinpointed them, start exploring alternative perspectives.
Yeah.
Maybe do some research, talk to people with different viewpoints, or even try experimenting with a new approach yourself.
So it's all about just being open to new possibilities
Yes.
and not being afraid to shake things up a bit.
Exactly. Because you know what? Ubiquity doesn't necessarily equal excellence.
That's a good point.
A lot of times, the most groundbreaking ideas come from challenging what everyone else is doing.
Dr. L's article also touched on something that I think a lot of people struggle with.
What's that?
The impact of change on relationships.
Oh, yeah.
It's something that college students deal with a lot,
Uh-huh.
as they're figuring out who they are, what's important to them.
Absolutely. Relationships are constantly evolving, just like everything else.
Yeah.
As we grow and change, the dynamics of our relationships often need to adjust too.
It's easy to assume, I think, that relationships should just stay the same.
Right.
But that's not really realistic, is it?
Not at all. And sometimes those ubiquitous expectations that we place on relationships,
Oh, like what?
like the whole happily ever after fairy tale,
Yeah.
those can actually get in the way of real connection and growth.
So instead of clinging to these rigid ideas about how things should be,
Yeah.
it's more about embracing that kind of fluidity of relationships.
Yes.
And just being open to those natural shifts that happen over time.
Precisely. And that goes back to what we were saying earlier about communication.
Uh-huh.
When we can openly and honestly express our needs and our expectations, we create space for relationships to evolve in a healthy way.
It strikes me that this whole idea of embracing change and challenging norms,
Yeah.
it's especially important in today's world,
Right.
where technology is just so ubiquitous.
Absolutely. Technology has brought so many amazing opportunities, but it also presents some really unique challenges. Well, I'm thinking the constant influx of information. It can be pretty overwhelming.
Oh, yeah.
It's easy to get caught in that cycle of scrolling and consuming
Mm-hmm.
without really absorbing anything meaningful.
Yeah, it's we need to be more mindful about how we use technology and how we allow it to shape our thoughts and our behaviors.
Exactly. We need to be intentional about creating space for reflection
Yeah.
and critical thinking.
Right. So it's about recognizing that ubiquitous presence of technology in our lives
Uh-huh.
and then making conscious choices about how we engage with it.
That's it.
It's fascinating how this simple word, ubiquitous,
Right.
can lead to such deep and insightful conversation.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? It really highlights how powerful language is.
Yeah.
To help us understand these complex ideas.
Yeah.
And make connections we might not have otherwise seen.
So, listeners, as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I encourage you to keep reflecting on this concept of ubiquity.
Yeah, think about it.
How does it show up in your life?
Good question.
What are the potential benefits and drawbacks?
And most importantly, how can you use this understanding to become a more effective communicator,
Yeah.
a more innovative thinker, a more adaptable individual?
Stay tuned. We wrap up our exploration of ubiquitous right after. As we've been talking about ubiquity, I keep thinking back to that Professional Leadership Institute article. That argued that ubiquity itself isn't a competitive advantage.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point.
Right. It really challenges us to think beyond just being present everywhere and focus on what truly makes something stand out.
Totally. It's not enough to just be everywhere.
Right.
You really have to offer something unique, something that solves a problem.
Yeah.
Or meets a need in a way that others aren't.
Exactly. So it's where disruption comes into play.
I think so.
True innovation often involves shaking things up,
Yeah, it does.
challenging those ubiquitous norms and finding those gaps where things could be done better.
Absolutely.
So it's almost like we need to develop this ubiquity radar,
Ubiquity radar. I like that.
constantly scanning our surroundings for those things that everyone just accepts without question.
Right. The things we take for granted.
Yeah, and asking ourselves, could this be improved? Is there a different approach that might be more effective?
I love that. Be on the lookout for opportunities to, disrupt and innovate,
Yeah.
even in areas that just seem totally set in stone.
And remember how that Business Day article talked about companies?
Yeah.
They're always striving for ubiquity in their marketing.
Right. They want to be everywhere all the time.
Well, what if they channeled some of that energy into disrupting their own industries?
Ooh.
Imagine the possibilities.
It's exciting to think about. Instead of trying to just blend in and be everywhere,
Yeah.
what if they focused on really differentiating themselves?
Right.
Offering something so unique and valuable that it, challenges the existing paradigms.
That's what real leadership is all about, right?
Yeah. It is. Having the courage to take risks, to experiment, embrace those failures as learning opportunities,
Right.
and just to constantly push the boundaries of what's possible.
And, it doesn't have to be some grand sweeping change.
Sure.
Sometimes disruption can happen in small incremental steps.
Right.
It could be as simple as questioning a long-held assumption in your team or coming up with a more efficient way to do a routine task.
I see what you mean.
It's about having that mindset of continuous improvement.
Totally. Always looking for ways to, do things better.
Yeah,
Even if it means challenging how it's always been done.
exactly. It's about thinking outside the box,
Yeah.
being resourceful, not being afraid to experiment,
I like it.
and remembering that ubiquity. While it can bring comfort and familiarity,
Right.
it can also lead to stagnation if we're not careful. So to our amazing listeners out there, we challenge you. Embrace the idea of constructive disruption. Question those ubiquitous norms. Stay curious. And don't be afraid to shake things up a bit.
It's good advice. Who knows, maybe you'll be the one to spark the next wave of innovation.
It could happen.
The most groundbreaking ideas often come from those who are willing to challenge how things have always been done.
And to imagine a different way of doing things.
That's the key.
And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive on ubiquitous.
This was a good one.
I hope you've enjoyed this exploration and that you've gained some valuable insights that you can apply to your own life.
It was fun. Remember, the power of understanding ubiquitous is recognizing both its potential and its limitations.
It's true.
By embracing change, challenging assumptions, and never stopping learning, you can harness the power of ubiquity
Yeah.
to become a more effective communicator, a more innovative thinker, and a more impactful individual.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey, and we'll see you next time on The Daily Brain. See you then. Where we'll continue to explore the fascinating world of words and ideas.